So it seems like we finally have official numbers for Baldur's Gate 3. 15 million units sold, which of course would be very respectable. It would be considered a success. It would be good for Larian if they hadn't spent the past year pretending as if the game was some unprecedented success story that Nintendo could not possibly compete with. Tears of the Kingdom outsold it, Mario Wonder outsold it, Pokemon outsold it. And that's just the recent releases. I remember people being told that Baldur's Gate 3 had sold like 32 million units in a week. So seeing it being officially confirmed that it sold about half that across several platforms after all that hype, all that publicity, all that attention, sold significantly less than Elden Ring, as I said it had, it really puts things into perspective as to what the problem actually is when it comes to game journalism. They can't just let something be as successful for what it is or talk about it and enjoy it and just, be realistic about its success. No, they have to go out of their way to make it look like a way bigger deal than it actually is. For Baldur's Gate 3, this involved pretending it was some industry defining RPG when it wasn't, pretending that it had this really engaging storyline when it didn't, when it had like really good romance options when it did not, pretending that like it had a really good combat system, it did not, pretending that the things it was doing were unprecedented in the gaming industry, right? You see so many people like constantly talking about how Swen, he respects his employees. They're independent. Like Larian is independent. When the reality is quite different, right? And again, I've been talking about these things for the past year, but we are at the point now where the reality behind Baldur's Gate 3 has to be exposed so the industry can move on to the next major thing, right? This is something that the game journalists just pulled out of their ass to try and keep people from paying attention to Nintendo. Because if you actually were plugged into the Nintendo ecosystem, if you actually did know what was going on, you would be very well aware that nothing that any game studio is producing can compete with Nintendo, right? I've said this about Elden Ring, about Baldur's Gate 3, and I'm saying it about Grand Theft Auto 6 now, right? Nothing that these studios can produce is going to outperform what Nintendo is doing, right? I made a comment some time ago about how the Grand Theft Auto brand, the best-selling non-Nintendo brand in history, right? Uh, well, actually, it is the highest-selling video game franchise in the world, right? Grand Theft Auto 5 has sold like 200 million units, right? This is a true earth-shattering success story, right? Grand Theft Auto 6 is way bigger than Baldur's Gate 3 by every metric. There is no denying that, right? But when you actually look at the numbers, when you look at like how viable the brands actually are, you see that like although Grand Theft Auto generates a ton of income for the video game releases, it has absolutely no potential when it comes to spin-off material, when it comes to adaptions, when it comes to comics, when it comes to like merchandising, right? Grand Theft Auto is entirely reliant on initial game sales and microtransactions. And of course, that's like Rockstar is making that work for themselves. It's not that big of a deal. But when you compare it to something like Pokemon, which is extremely merchandisable, which does have a lot going for it, while still having games that outperform slop like Baldur's Gate 3, right? When you look at like Pokemon and its success with the trading card games and the anime and everything else it's doing, you see just how productive the IP actually is, right? And you're starting to see that kind of growth with a lot of other smaller Nintendo IPs, as opposed to companies like Rockstar or Larian who are entirely reliant on one or two major things. So you see that Nintendo has a much wider ecosystem. It has its own hardware. It has a bunch of its own developers that cater to a lot of different audiences, right? They are objectively in a way better position than anybody else in the industry. But we are in this really weird period where the game journals are trying to gaslight people into thinking that Nintendo is running out of steam, that the Switch isn't successful, that they're not doing very well. Like, how many times have we been told over the past year that The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom bombed after selling 20 million units? After being like the fastest selling Zelda ever, after the success of Breath of the Wild, in spite of everything else. Like, they are seriously going to tell you that selling 20 million units is somehow a bomb. And this is the real problem with Baldur's Gate 3, right? This is the problem with everything else they prop up and they talk about, right? Like, they seriously want to gaslight you into thinking that something like Tears of the Kingdom is a failure. Something like Super Mario Bros. Wonder is a failure. Something like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is a failure. Like, every single time we go through this song and dance where these game journals come out and do everything in their power to try and gaslight people into thinking that the third party developers are somehow doing better than what Nintendo is doing. And that is not and never has been true. And we've seen that over the years as over and over and over again, every IP that they crop up slowly starts fading away into irrelevancy, whether it's Final Fantasy or Halo or Mass Effect, right? All of them fall by the wayside eventually. When you see this happen so many times, you really start losing faith in game journals to give you an adequate view of the situation, right? They don't actually want Nintendo to succeed. The more you see them comment on these situations, the more you see their war perspective, the more you begin to understand that. Not once have I heard them like really come out and call like Tears of the Kingdom like a success story. Not once have I seen them acknowledge the success of Mario Wonder, but they'll bend over backwards to pretend Baldur's Gate 3 was something spectacular when it wasn't in any way, shape, or form. And that to me is a very good sign of just how desperate they are. This is, I think, going to be a really interesting situation over the next year or so because I think this is a make it or break it moment for Nintendo. I think if we can successfully get a new console out, have a really good first year, have people get excited about it, have people like really start condemning game journal takes in regards to new upcoming Nintendo games, like we might actually be able to break this cycle of just this endless attempts at like sabotaging Nintendo releases. And we're definitely making major strides towards that point, right? IGN came after Mario and Luigi Brothership, and everyone immediately called their bluff, immediately called them out on it. And I do think that's probably going to be a reoccurring trend with like lesser known Nintendo IPs. Like when Donkey came after like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, like everyone called him a raging fucking retard. And yeah, I stand by that statement, right? Like, Donkey should never again cover a Nintendo RPG if that's how he's gonna try to play it, right? Like it's and there are of course like lots of other examples of like fans of smaller Nintendo franchises coming out and defending their favorite games. Fire Emblem Engage, I think, after that initial tepid response, people doing everything they can to damage control it, it now does have a very dedicated fan base of people who really love and appreciate it for what it is. And the same thing is happening to Echoes of Wisdom and I believe Mario Wonder and Tears of the Kingdom now. Now that the initial damage control is over, people are finally allowed to really discuss the game and really evaluate it for what it is, like positive and negative, instead of this really warped, like confused attempt at damage controlling. Right now, Mario and Luigi, although people are overwhelmingly positive towards the game, I have seen a lot of people try and cope and seethe about it. I've seen people say all sorts of weird things, like oh, all the islands are disconnected from each other. Yeah, you're connecting them. That's the entire point. But I want to be able to walk from one side of the map to the other. It's just like, what the fuck are you even talking about? Like, it's you see these complaints about brothership, and more so than I think, like the more mainstream Nintendo games, like a lot of them really fall flat, and it really does feel like people aren't really buying it at all. Even if you're not interested in Mario and Luigi, you can look at these criticisms and realize that, like, wow, this is a load of crap. And I do think this is going to extend to like essentially every Nintendo IP that isn't Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon. Because if you're criticizing a game you've never played before, if you have no history with it or you know nothing about it, like you are going to get exposed over and over and over again by people who know what they're talking about. For more niche Nintendo games, like the game journos cannot afford the resources and the manpower and the shilling to go after them to the same extent that they did with Tears of the Kingdom and Mario Wonder. So it's definitely going to be really interesting to see the decline of the Nintendo hate community in the next several years as Nintendo puts out more and more quality games, puts out new hardware, and just dismantles all these weird narratives about them. It is going to be something to see, and it's really it's really obvious that Baldur's Gate 3 is going to completely fade from memory and be forgotten.